Welcome to the lecture on Topic 2, Parents' Involvement with the Child Protection System in Module 3, Parenting Capacity. My name is Traci LaLiberte. I am the Executive Director for the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare at the University of Minnesota in the School of Social Work. I wear many hats in this life, including that of mother, researcher, and practitioner from both the fields of developmental disabilities and child protective services. When I say that I am an insider, it is that I am an insider to child protection. I was a worker, supervisor, trainer, and hotline manager. At that time, and still today, in many jurisdictions, the practice assumptions and policy structures place families headed by a parent with an intellectual and developmental disability on a trajectory of out-of-home care and/or termination of parental rights. While I am occasionally criticized for talking in my lectures or presentations about the shortcomings of the child protection system, I do so as an insider trying desperately to improve a practice that I love, a field that I love, child protection. I offer my critiques not to be harsh or unyielding in judgment, but rather to make you think and to understand that you too have a role in improving service delivery across systems in human services. Along those lines, it is important for me that I not only talk the talk, but I also walk the walk, so to speak. I want you to know that I really do understand this work. In order to do that, you need to know some additional information about me and my past. At one point in time, I was a young child protection worker, and I was assigned a case that involved a mom with an intellectual disability. She was in the hospital and had just given birth. The hospital had made a report to Child Protection that this mother had an intellectual disability and was unable to care for the baby. Their determination to make this report and her inability to parent was based on her disability without mention of any action or omission of action that placed the baby in immediate harm. At that time, I knew enough to know that this situation was going to end poorly. I'm not sure if it was my prior work in the field of developmental disabilities or my cursory knowledge of the liability-driven decision-making of my agency, but nonetheless, I entered the hospital with a sinking feeling. After speaking with the mom and the nursing staff, I called my supervisor, and without much discussion, I was told to take the baby into care and arrange to make a home visit with the mom. I followed my directions. I removed that baby, and she never did go home. I completed the home visit and the rest of the investigation, writing a report I knew would receive at best a cursory review once the manager and legal team knew that the mom had an intellectual disability. I didn't fight. I didn't even advocate. I didn't quit my job in protest. The reality was, while I felt strongly about disability rights, I knew nothing about parenting capacity. I worked in a system in which it seemed I had to ensure the safety of kids who remained home, and that influenced me in ways that I am terribly regretful of today. Much time has passed, and I have learned a great deal since that child's removal from her mother. I can't apologize to that mom, but I can tell her story and my own part of what transpired. I can stand in presentations and deliver lectures and talk about the needs of child protection from a real place of knowing. Based upon my child protection experience in the 90s, where people with disabilities were lost in the system, not receiving good services, and almost always losing custody of their kids, I decided to return to school and get my degree, to be a scientist, a researcher. I thought being armed with information and skills would enable me to return to child protection and effect change as an insider, a noble but unknowingly lofty goal. It has been more than 15 years since I left Child Protection Services, and while I like to think that my work in my current capacity at the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare has made a difference, much remains unchanged in that there is a continued existence of a workforce largely uneducated in providing services to parents with disabilities, and therefore their inability to advocate for the things they need in order to provide effective services for those families remains today. We also largely still lack accessible services, and we continue the use of biased assessment instruments, risk tools, and poorly constructed or adapted intervention programs which render the workforce ineffective. What I hope you take from this introduction is that I am steeped in the realities of this work on the child protection side, from that of worker, supervisor, and manager. For perspective, let me say a couple things about our center. As I said earlier, I am the executive director of a research and training center at the University of Minnesota called the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare. Our mission and work scope is broad, but squarely positioned within child protection. I have the privilege to instruct and directly influence the education and ongoing training and professional development of both new and existing child protection social workers, while also affecting policy based on my research and that of many people around the world. We also act as a clearinghouse of sorts for research, policy, and practice that are relevant to the child protection field, and more specifically to the training and education of the workforce. It is my hope that after this lecture, you go to our website and see what materials available are of interest to you and help in your practice. Today's lecture is going to give you an introduction. I'm going to give you a primer on child protection. We're going to talk about parents with cognitive limitations in the child protection system, and then I'm going to focus for a brief period of time on the importance of training of child welfare professionals. Before we begin to specifically talk about parents with cognitive disabilities in child protection, with a focus on the myriad of systemic issues at play, I will provide you with a very brief primer on child protection to make sure that we're all operating from the same base knowledge. Many people seem to know what child protection is either through watching television or movies or based on professional or personal experiences. Child protection is a legislated aspect of human services, and therefore it is one in which ultimately society has some say. As a society, we define what is and is not acceptable in terms of maltreatment. Where do we decide to draw the line? Are we going to be a society that allows physical discipline? Perhaps it's okay as long as you don't leave a mark. Perhaps we don't want to allow physical discipline, such as spanking or any other kind of action. As a society comes to consensus, it's reflected in the community's will. That is generally how it's supposed to happen, but we all know that power and privilege and community standing also play into this and influences our laws and community standards. As jurisdictions across the world determine what is within the parameters of their child protection field, a philosophy of practice is developed. This might mean that child protection will be narrow in scope, looking only at immediate danger and safety. This is a system called child protection. Others will choose a broader scope with comprehensive response, which includes protection and safety, but also extends to include risk of harm and prevention of maltreatment. This would be considered child welfare. Often, throughout your readings, in conversations, and lectures, you will hear these two terms used interchangeably. Please know that they are not the same thing. There is a difference in scope. However, often, as I said, these are used interchangeably across the world. Once the parameters of service systems are established, or in some cases of child welfare reform, these are reestablished. Once this happens, processes, tools, and resources for delivering child protection services are created so that families can be served. On your screen, you will see a structure for Minnesota's Child Protection Response System. Let me briefly talk you through the structure in front of you. At the top, you see a square that says intake. This is the time at which a call comes into child protection. People in the community suspect maltreatment, or they're concerned about what's happening in a family, and they want to tell someone to see if somebody could check out if the kids are okay. This could be the police, medical professionals, teachers. It might also be neighbors or family members. Intake is the process of taking in information from a reporter into the child protection system. It's a documentation process. The next point on the screen is screening. This is when the information that was delivered through the intake process gets reviewed. In Minnesota, that has to be reviewed within 24 hours. And depending on what the allegation is, if it's an assault, it also has to be re-reported to law enforcement. This might be different in different jurisdictions. The screening process leads to a decision where a case is either screened in or screened out. If a case meets the parameters that we talked about earlier in terms of what the law says qualifies for a child protection investigation, that case will be screened in. If there isn't enough information, or the allegation might be about concerns of potential harm for a child, that case will likely be screened out. In the case where there is a screen out, voluntary services may still be extended to a family, or other types of referrals to parent support programs or outreach programs might be made. Perhaps it's an issue of children's mental health. That won't just stop, that concern doesn't just end, but a referral might be made. But a child protection report may not be warranted. In cases where the information results in something being screened in Minnesota, a couple of things could happen. A formal investigation takes place, or sometimes we do what we call a family assessment. The difference in those two in our state is based upon the level of risk. High-risk cases where there's egregious harm or neglect, broken bones, burns, sexual abuse, those types of allegations will always receive a formal investigation, which often involves court involvement and sometimes involves the police. Lower risk cases where there is concern, perhaps lack of supervision, kids are being exposed to domestic violence, there's presence of substance abuse and lack of provision of necessities, neglect types of allegations, that will likely receive a family assessment. In Minnesota, these things are largely the same, but they do have a different trajectory. Cases usually receive approximately a 45-day investigation, and again, this will differ in different places around the world. But a formal fact-finding process takes place, and at the end of that, professionals and families sit together to determine whether or not maltreatment did in fact occur. In different places in the world, there may be a legal ramification to that determination, or there may not. But at some point, people will sit down and say, hey, this is what's happening and here's the concern. Or it doesn't seem as though this happened. We're going to close that case. This investigation didn't find anything. If the case is closed, that's the end of it. Perhaps something happened, but it doesn't warrant court involvement or a more serious response. Families may be offered services in those situations. In situations where there's egregious harm or neglect, children may be removed from their parent in order to ensure their immediate safety and protection. The goal, in the vast majority of those cases, is always that the child return home, that a child does best in their family of origin when their parent is able to safely and adequately provide care for them. These are assumptions that we have in our system based on much research in child development and child well-being that we know kids do well in families. But they're not always safe in families, and sometimes things have to take place, changes must be made in order for them to be safe. That, in a nutshell, is child protection. And again, it looks differently in different jurisdictions around the world, but essentially, that's it. I wanted to add a slide here to just make very clear that the assumption for all people working across child welfare, whether they're medical people, law enforcement, social work, all of the myriad disciplines that are involved have the shared primary goal that child protection, you see it CPS on the screen, Child Protection Services, the goal is to keep kids safe. Other assumptions that I want you to think about is that child protection work is incredibly hard. People don't greet you at the door thinking, oh, I'm so glad that you're here. There's defensiveness, there's guilt, there's shame associated with having an outside person come into your family to say, hey, you did something to your child. It's hard work. The child protection workforce is made up of many, many people. It's not just the child protection worker themselves. There's lawyers, healthcare professionals, experts, service providers, teachers. Many, many people across our communities make up child protection workforce. People are doing the best they can with what they have. This is an assumption that I ask people to go in with. Not everyone comes with an equal set of knowledge or skills. Sometimes there can be a win and a lose at the same time in child protection. And what I mean by that is a win is that a child is safe. A lose is that that child might lose their family and where they live, their home, their school, their friends. There's a win and a lose, and those are very challenging things to balance. Many fields of study are competing for training time across this workforce, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more later. One of the other things that I want you to think about in terms of child protection and to just know as a primer outside of disability is that neglect is by far the most common form of maltreatment. And this is particularly true in cases involving parents with cognitive limitations. You can take some time and read the definition on your screen to learn more about the parameters of neglect as we define it in Minnesota. These are very common across other jurisdictions in the world. Please keep in mind that while neglect is the most common form of maltreatment, and it's the one I chose to highlight for you today, it is not the only type of maltreatment. Parents and other perpetrators of maltreatment are also responsible for things such as physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and educational neglect. Jurisdictions around the world organize the types of maltreatment slightly differently. They might call them different things. However, the ones I have named are the primary types of maltreatment that are addressed within these types of systems around the world. Let's talk for a minute about parents with cognitive limitations in child protection. Whenever I lecture or present on this topic, I usually start by saying, the information that I'm going to present is about providing equal access within this system, fair and balanced assessments within our system. And this group of parents, parents with intellectual or cognitive limitations, often don't receive that fair treatment. And therefore, I lecture on it. But never am I going to say that all parents with disabilities can parent or should be allowed to parent. Just as I would never say all parents without disability can parent or should be allowed to parent. The key to child protection and working with parents with disability is that we have to have thorough assessments that are fair and accessible, which measure parenting capacity and child safety, rather than being driven by fears, bias, and prejudice. Let's talk a little bit about what we know about parents with intellectual or cognitive limitations that are involved in child protection. In general, we know people with disabilities face many challenges. You've learned that in this course and perhaps in others. Challenges include poverty, unemployment, underemployment, isolation, homelessness. These challenges impact parents who don't have disability as well, and they are often common factors in child protection cases, especially those neglect cases that I spoke to you about. Challenges such as these, however, impact parenting for parents with cognitive limitations and disability in increasingly complex ways. When a worker or a system is ill-equipped to handle that complexity, it has poor outcomes for the parent and the child. What we also know is that barriers across policy and practice for adequately serving parents with disability exist throughout the child protection process. These things include screening and risk assessment, parenting capacity and parent-child interactions, the workforce which is ill-prepared through poor preparation or lack of training, service delivery, or the lack of knowledge for accommodations and allowances for modification. Policies that rely on a disability label to inform decision-making, such as termination of parental rights policies, and I will talk more about that in a moment. To be honest, I could talk for hours about each one of these items. However, we have limited time, so I'm going to focus this lecture on the child protection workforce and issues related to discrimination and systemic issues, specifically training. That said, you're also going to watch a video for this week's lecture called A Fair Chance, where you will get additional content directly related to the other challenges and lack of screening and assessment tools, poor availability of services, and structural challenges within the child protection system. Let me spend just a moment to provide you with a clear example of a policy challenge before moving on to focus on training and the workforce in child protection. A while back, a colleague and I became interested in how custody statutes in the United States treated parenting with disability within statute. What we found was both predictable and yet shocking. We learned that in 37 states, the presence of a disability label was included as grounds for termination of parental rights in 37 states. 37! These laws are often antiquated and discriminatory, and yet they have gone unaddressed. In the 10 years since this study was published, only 4 states have made changes. So as you can see, the bias against parents with disabilities is rooted in our history. It is rooted in our policy. So it is no wonder that when researchers study bias and discrimination, the experiences that these families have within our system, it is pervasive. The next 3 slides detail what several research studies have found with regard to discrimination against parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities, cognitive limitations within the child protection system, and largely across professionals themselves. I will talk through them briefly. Workers presume there is inevitable neglect or abuse. It's similar to the example I gave you when I went to the hospital and had to remove that newborn baby. The supervisor that I spoke to never asked about the mom's ability or capacity. It was assumed that because there was the disability, inevitably there would be neglect or abuse. There was no way around it. The disability would result in these things. And we know that is not true. Number 2, workers assume that the parent's deficits can't be fixed. Another thing that we know is not true. Parents are able to learn. Parents are able to develop systems of support and resource that allows them to modify deficits, ameliorate deficits in their parenting skills. Workers mistake child abuse or neglect to be the direct result of the disability rather than environmental factors. We've already discussed this several slides back. Issues of poverty, poor housing, lack of education, all of those factors that contribute to neglect in any family, regardless of disability, are at play in these families as well. But rather than focus on those factors, child protection workers tend to focus on the disability as the cause. Parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities are vulnerable and may not understand how they are perceived or the gravity of the situation which they are in. What this really is talking about is not that they're vulnerable and unable to function as a parent, but that there are people who will take advantage of them, that there are people who in investigations may not provide them with all of the facts about their rights, and that they actually don't have to talk to an investigator without a person that might be of a support standing with them. They have some options, and if they aren't aware of that, that makes them particularly vulnerable. People with disabilities also receive voluntary services throughout the course of their life, and as a new social worker shows up and introduces themselves in that way, they may not understand the gravity of what these allegations are. They may perceive that person is there to help, like other people have been in the past. And this situation is certainly different. Number 5, inadequate services result in discrimination or system abuse. You've heard me talk a little bit about that. The reality is very few places in the world have services that are specifically developed to meet the needs of parents with disability, parents with intellectual disability, in terms of parenting classes, services, arranging support, and ongoing parenting resources. Workers believe that interdependent parenting or co-parenting is unacceptable. I believe this is changing. Some of these issues of discrimination were studied many years ago, and while most of them continue to be very much at play today, interdependent parenting is becoming more acceptable both within child protection systems but also within the court system. That parents can demonstrate through the use of others who are reliable and predictable resources that they are able and capable of parenting. Number 7, the child welfare system is inherently child-focused, and it leaves workers unable to focus on parental needs. This can largely be true. Again, this is different in different jurisdictions. As we move on, the last 3, workers see themselves as experts. In child protection, this is a field of a worker that has to come in and explain that the community standard for maltreatment is that you can't do some of the things that they're doing. It usurps parents' power. They feel defensive. Workers, over time, start to see themselves as the expert, that they know better, that they may see strengths and protective factors different than the parent does, and that's a dangerous place to be. Provider agencies deliver poor assessments. This is very significant when we think about parenting with disability in child protection. If you can't get a high quality assessment that truly assesses that parent's needs, then everything else in the case is based upon bad information. For instance, if we say to a parent, go for this parent-child interaction assessment or a parenting capacity assessment at 321 Main Street, and it's in a psychologist's office, they are not in their surroundings. They are not able to demonstrate, to show in concrete ways how they know how to do things. It becomes abstract. It becomes a verbal exercise in describing their parenting, which can be very challenging for some people with this type of disability. People also try to rely on standardized testing such as IQ, which lacks individual attention and doesn't focus on the strengths of that parent. All of these things lead to poor assessments. Number 10, worker has conflicting responsibilities of policing and helping. This is a balance that challenges child welfare workers consistently across the board with all families, not just families with intellectual or developmental disability. As with other populations who experience discrimination and prejudice, parents with disabilities are often disproportionately involved in child protection services. My colleagues and I recently conducted a study to examine if there was a particular point in the child protection system where this discrimination seemed to be happening. Essentially, can we point to the workforce directly in which we can advocate strongly for changes to training as a potential solution for improving services to parents with disabilities in child protection? Things we were thinking about included, if it was at the earliest point in the case, the investigation, then bias likely starts outside the system in terms of who is getting reported to child protection in the first place. The next point is whether or not child protection accepts more cases involving parents with disabilities than not. Next, we wondered if children of these parents are taken into out-of-home care at greater rates, and ultimately if the parents' rights are terminated at higher rates than people without disabilities. What we found for parents with a variety of types of disabilities, as you can see on the slide, is that indeed parents with disabilities are involved in child protection cases more than one would expect, 2.71 times more likely to be involved in a child protection investigation than parents without disability. The rates of involvement of parents with disabilities changed throughout the key decision-making points in the child protection system. Parents with disabilities became increasingly overrepresented throughout the child protection process at the point of experiencing a termination of parental rights, even when we controlled for race, ethnicity, gender, and economic status. So in this study, we tried to address those issues of poverty that we talked about earlier and really drill down to see whether or not it was the disability, the presence of a disability, that was somehow playing into this disproportionality. And it did show that that was true. Now, in this particular study, if you look in the center of your slide, 1.07 times more likely to be an out-of-home placement. The reality is, in this particular study, and you can read more about this in your assigned readings, families headed by a parent with an intellectual disability did not have children in out-of-home placement at significantly higher rates than other people, in part because in this jurisdiction, anyone that got an investigation was already at high risk for child's placement. What's very interesting is the move between the blue box and the yellow box on your slide. kids of parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities had much higher rates of termination, of permanent separation from their parent, than kids in families where there wasn't disability. Because this happens within the system, there isn't community influence at this point in time in that decision making, we know that the discrepancy is within the system. So the question becomes, is there more maltreatment by people with disabilities, and therefore you would expect higher rates of termination? Or is there bias and discrimination in terms of finding permanent solutions within their family of origin? What this study tells us, and others like it, is that there are issues occurring within the child protection system in decision points where staff likely bring in bias. There are numerous ways to begin to address this: staff training, additional tools and resources, etc. And we will talk about that more in a moment. For now, let's review what implications emerged from this particular study. First, the disparity may be reinforced by the presence of policies that work against parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities, or absence of policies that serve to support the role of parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Take a moment to read the text on your screen. Next, let's review practice implications. Assessment and identification of disability in order to provide tailored services to deliver an array of service types is critical to reducing disparate involvement of parents with disabilities. Training is a crucial tool to combat the disparate involvement of parents with disabilities. If workers know how to work with disability and with parents who have different types of disability, then their ability to meet that parent's needs is increased. Finally, we must think about what else we don't know so that we can learn and become better equipped to provide high-quality services. To that end, there are research implications which tell us that more research is needed to disentangle the complex issues involved in over-involvement of parents with disabilities in child protection. Take a moment to review what is on your screen. I mentioned the video A Fair Chance earlier in this lecture. Sometimes I find it challenging for students to understand life as a parent with a disability and what some of the challenges are that they face in their parenting. This video that I have assigned to you does a terrific job of showing you the lives of 6 families in which at least one parent has an intellectual disability and is child welfare involved. Listen closely to the narration of this video as it also provides additional content for this lecture and strong insight into the challenges that child protection faces in providing services to these families. We must move forward and make improvements to the system and for the professionals that work within that system. I've identified numerous problems of the system. I don't know any social workers who get into the field who want to malign or hurt families. They want to help, but we must have systems that support their work so that fair and high-quality assessments and services can be delivered. So where do we go from here? It is my belief as a researcher, an academic, and as a practitioner that making real and lasting change related to the experiences of parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities involved in child protection lies largely in the workforce, in colleagues such as yourselves, in people who are still studying and going to be moving into this field. The child protection workforce faces numerous issues with some of the highest turnover rates in human services, high caseloads, constantly changing administrations, and by extension philosophies of practice, poor or absent supervision. The list goes on and on. I imagine that in some ways you can connect all research back to the workforce in terms of how they do their job or something they can use or interventions they might refer people to. But I'm looking at this from a more narrow view. We can study interventions, develop programs, and fair and standardized assessments for parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities. All of these things are needed. But if the workforce does not have the knowledge, skill, or attitude to position themselves to take advantage of that research or to effectively work with parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities, then the rest of it is for naught. Unless they have the knowledge and employ attitudes and skills for effectively working with parents, they can't assess parents. They can't create safety plans for children. They can't assist the courts in understanding parental capacity. They can't offer supervision in cases involving parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities, or they can't steer the direction of their agency with regard to effective practice. Now, perhaps I've created a false dichotomy of the chicken and the egg, and I imagine a number of you might disagree with me about whether training and education really comes first in trying to improve services for parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities within child protection. In a conference recently in Melbourne, I made this argument, and I'm going to share it with you now for your consideration. You will be the next professionals in the field, and it's important for you to think about system change, so you will likely see something about this in your discussion questions. Actually, I guarantee it. So let's go through my assertion that preparing the child protection workforce, largely through training, is the essential step in seeing fair and effective service delivery for parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities in the child protection system. Before I get to that in the next couple of slides, I'm going to make a preemptive statement, as I imagine some of you in your discussion questions will challenge me on my points. So I would say three things. Number one, when I talk about training and education, I am not referring to training that is, quote, one and done. I think that training needs to be multi-pronged and that it has to be scaffold and follow adult learning principles. Rethink and re-envision how training is done so that it is repetitive, that it has coaching components, that it is done over time so that workers' capacity continues to grow. If you want to challenge me and say that training and education don't work, I will likely respond to you that we've been doing it wrong. Number two, in my assertion that training comes first, child protection professionals may not be able to secure services for families if the priority isn't about creating services. But they could be positioned to advocate for needed services and become allies in efforts to develop services and create continued system involvement. These are the people we want as our partners, as our future researchers, and who will influence policy. We need to affect change from the inside out. Number three, last point. I do not believe that there is a silver bullet or an easy answer, or even that it's a linear approach. What I do believe is that the workforce is essential in the solution of improving practice for people working with parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities in child protection. Let me say that again. It's the takeaway of my entire argument. I do not believe there is a silver bullet or an easy answer, or even that it's a linear approach. I do believe that the workforce is essential in the solution, and without them, at best, we will be slow to make change, and at worst, change will cease to occur. Wearing my insider hat, I'm going to tell you a few things. Child protection work is really hard work. Most workers that I have known in my life have suffered from secondary trauma, not only due to the situations of the families they work with, but because of the system in which they work. They live under fire each and every day. They are villainized in the newspaper, by stakeholders in the system, and by the families they are trying to help. They are identified as the root of the problem by researchers. In their jobs, they are able to please no one. It is humanly impossible to know all of the things they need to know in order to do their jobs effectively. They feel the pressure to be experts in substance abuse, experts in domestic violence, in mental health, experts in child development and maltreatment. They must be effective in engaging people in the most difficult and awful moments of their lives while maintaining a professional distance and managing their inevitable human and sometimes turbulent emotions. Imagine that you are 22 years old, or perhaps 32 years old. You may or may not be parenting children. Each comes with its own influences and bias. You've been working in child protection for a month and have felt capable and ready to help families and their children. After your first week, in which you attended 4 days of training, you were assigned a caseload of 10 families. In your second week, you had to go to court on 2 cases. You hadn't yet met the families for either case because you had been in training, but your supervisor was going to go with you. An emergency came up in the office and your supervisor couldn't go. You were told you only had to appear and ask for a continuance, but ended up having to take the stand and testify in one of the cases. You had read the case record but hardly remembered it, and yet you answered the questions the best that you could. The judge chastised you for being unprepared, and the parent's attorney called you inept on the stand. You felt horrible, but knew it was all true despite doing the very best that you could. You left not understanding the outcome of the hearing and had to see another family. Your self-doubt consumed you so much that you could taste it. In the next week, you attended 3 more days of training and were assigned 10 additional cases involving 5 kids from 3 families who were living in out-of-home care. Your supervisor told you that their monthly worker visit was overdue, but since you just got the case, were in training, and had to go to more training next week, not to worry about it. She was sure the kids were fine despite 4 messages that were on your voicemail from the foster mom asking that one of the kids be moved immediately. I think you get my point and where I'm going with this. While I wish I were exaggerating, I am not. And this is the lived experience of new child protection workers all over the world. These realities are not an excuse for bad practice, but when you are trying to effect change in a system that devours its own, where some jurisdictions have 50, 60, 70, even 80% turnover in a year, you must understand the context in which you are asking people to change while they are simply trying to survive. If you, as a researcher, as a colleague, as a service provider, see the child protection worker as the enemy or as the problem, rather than the potential solution and as a partner, then your efforts are doomed to fail. Before we get talking about training or competencies, let's start with some basics. Now, we are all professionals, and I'm not saying anything that you don't already know in terms of involving practitioners in the merits of participatory action-based research and policy development. I will say again, however, whether you say it to them or not, they will know if you think that they, the worker, is the problem. Be careful and be respectful, or you are done before you begin. Workers and supervisors need you as a colleague, as service providers, as researchers, as advocates, whatever your role might be. Your success in working with child protection will be in part related to your approach and your explanation of the problem or your concerns of what's happening. Perhaps you offer some observations. Make personalized statements of what you have experienced or seen in the context of empathizing with their realities. Offer to partner with child protection in small and concrete ways. Be their ally in being able to do their work with parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities while recognizing that they need training. Child protection training must be application-based. It can't be about telling professionals that they don't know what they're doing. They have a lot of people that are telling them that already. No one likes to feel incompetent. They are doing the very best they can and barely hanging on. And as a means of survival, they hold on to the notion that they are in fact competent to do this impossible job. What is their alternative? In a study that I completed nearly 10 years ago, I attempted to understand worker and supervisor competence in working with parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities. For a number of reasons, I decided to examine their perception of competency rather than their actual competence. Respondents reported overwhelmingly so that they were competent to highly competent in working with parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities. In the same study, however, nearly 87% of respondents reported the need for training across all competency areas identified for working with parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Like many of us, they don't know what they don't know. They need help, and while some know it but can't make room for it, others need convincing or evidence that they need help through training. So, training. Currently, in the States and many places around the world, training systems are moving away from objective-based learning, more of that one and done kind of training, toward a competency-based system where they can identify the knowledge, skills, and attitudes most desired in a child welfare workforce over the course of their career. In the States, there are many versions of child protection competency statements, and systems have invested incredibly large amounts of money to develop their own sets. In the end, most of them cover the same areas, with a large gaping hole where disability, knowledge, skills, and attitudes should be. There is one exception, however, in Ohio, which I used in the research I previously told you about. While it isn't perfect, it does give us a place to start. There are some competencies specifically designed for child protection workers to know how to work with parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities. There is a reality of competing demands that we have to think about in our dissemination strategies and our approaches to influencing policy and ultimately practice. When a child protection worker is hired, regardless of their educational degree, they often go through a series of mandatory pre-service early employment training. This varies across the world, of course, and even in the U.S. Here's my point, and I'm setting this up to push you in your thinking. What we are talking about here is requiring disability training for all of those in child protection workforce. As students taking a course in disability, you already have this interest. This may seem like an odd thing for me to advocate for, but what you have to understand is that without a personal interest, people who go into this field are not exposed to any training related to disability. It's a gap, and I encourage you, as you become leaders in the field, to reach across service systems and to help other service systems like child protection recognize their need for this training. In this lecture, we've covered a lot of ground, including a primer on child protection, some of the issues faced by parents with disabilities in child protection, and different aspects of the system that need to be improved or changed in order to improve services to kids and families where a parent has an intellectual or developmental disability. Again, I anticipate that you'll be watching the video A Fair Chance shortly after this lecture, and that you'll be reading articles from the resource list. I will engage with you on the discussion board, and hopefully you will bring some good questions that we can engage in. The slide in front of you has some additional resources that you might consider reviewing. There's a special issue in the Journal of Public Child Welfare related to parenting with intellectual disability, a report called Rocking the Cradle, and some practice-based journal articles that are in a publication at my center called CW 360. All of these are included in your resource list. It's been my pleasure to deliver this lecture, and I hope that you've learned a little bit more about child protection, its systems, and the intersection with parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities. If you'd like to contact me directly, you are welcome to do that at any time. My email is on the screen, and again, I will be interacting with you on the discussion board and look forward to it. Thank you.